Hello, everybody. This is the program on constitutional government at Harvard. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and I'm here with my wife, Anna, and with my friend, Andy Zwick. And our guest today is Andre Archie. Andre Archie is an associate professor at Colorado State University, and he is a professor of ancient Greek philosophy. It's that specific. I don't know if there's also a professor of modern Greek philosophy,
right?
But
right.
they want to know, to identify as who you are. And so Professor Archie got his Ph.D. at Duquesne in the philosophy department, but before that he got his BA at Colorado State. He's published articles in the Journal of Philosophical Research, in ancient philosophy, and in the history of political thought. And he's the author of a book on Socrates Alcibiades. That's a Platonic dialogue, Alcibiades, came out in 2015. And he also has a political side. He's written articles, about 10 articles in the last 3-4 years in National Review. One of them especially caught my attention. I like the title, The Power of Bourgeois Norms. But he's got a book forthcoming called The Virtue of Color-Blindness. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So, Professor Archie, please.
Thank you so much. And as I said, I appreciate the invite. I've been a fan of yours for years, read you as a graduate student. I'm just happy that I have this opportunity. So the title of the book is The Virtue of Colorblindness. They set me up with a little fancy poster, I guess, to your left. So that's what I'll be talking about today. The book will be released January 2nd. And so you can pre-order if you'd like. So what I'll do is I'll give you a broad introduction to the book, try to give you some sense of the presuppositions, some of the arguments that I get into. So I'll read you a portion of my introduction, not a large portion, but a portion nonetheless. And then I'll walk you through the book and the various themes that I treat. And then we'll open it up for questions. So from the introduction, I truly believe that the United States of America is at a crossroads when it comes to race relations. As a country nearly 245 years old, we have, through fits and starts, navigated issues of race and identity as well as could be expected, given the tension brought about by our founding documents and their principles and the institution of slavery on our shores. But through it all, we've stayed true to the spirit of 1776 and 1863 by recognizing individual rights, not group rights. The American project extols the individual, not the group. This belief was reaffirmed in the Supreme Court's recent decision against affirmative action, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. So America and Americans intuitively know it's morally right to judge individuals based on their character and not their race. In other words, Americans know it's morally right to be colorblind. Recently, however, there has been a weariness when it comes to the issue of race. In light of George Floyd's death and the subsequent woke forces that have swept through American society, such a colorblind account is needed now more than ever. These woke forces have convinced the elites in education and industry to accept uncritically the claim that systemic racism against African Americans infects nearly all aspects of America and its institutions. This false accusation of systemic racism has now been embraced by titans of the tech industry, financial industries. But America seems to have been lulled and intimidated into equating the colorblind approach to race relations to a type of colorblind racism. This is unfortunate. This occurrence is unfortunate and portends a deep, dark future for the United States if left unchecked. Colorblind principles and actions engender natural sympathetic relations among Americans because they embody the presupposition of a shared American identity that transcends the relatively small differences between us. The conservative case for reclaiming this noble racial tradition of colorblindness, on the other hand, lies in the fact that Americans must conserve that which is best, that which is noble in our history. We must hold firm to the hard-won gains achieved on the racial front by reminding ourselves of the spirit of 1776 and 1863. To defend colorblind principles, conservatives must first reject an intellectual assumption popularized in the 19th century, and now the reigning assumption on most college campuses today. In his book On Liberty, British thinker John Stuart Mill argues that truth will emerge if competing ideas are equally entertained in the public square. Otherwise, according to Mill, we would be robbing the human race if these ideas are right, of the chance to exchange error for truth, and if they are wrong, of the chance to see more clearly because of the, quote, collision with error, end quote. Mill was committed to the belief that human progress is inevitable with the right elites in positions of power. As a matter of fact, the inevitable triumph of good ideas or truth is not guaranteed, and certain ideas should not be allowed to gain a foothold in the public square at all. Among those who understand that ideas have consequences, conservatives in particular should be aware of the moral hazard of legitimizing certain ideas by thinking they can be defeated solely by open and rational discussion. One such idea that conservatives failed to challenge and debunk before it took root in influential sectors and institutions of American society is the idea of anti-colorblindness. And this took place around the early 2000s, or at least its influential advocates of that position really started speaking up. My intention here then is to rehabilitate the noble racial tradition of colorblindness and to offer a much needed response to the peddlers of odd, anti-American racial ideas and theories that go against the American identity. These anti-American ideas and theories are variously known as multiculturalism, anti-racist pedagogy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and critical race theory, CRT. So that's the truncated version of my introduction to the book. I tried to streamline it as much as possible. And so what I'll do now is walk you through some various themes that I cover in relation to the claim that I'm promoting, or the thesis I'm promoting, which is colorblindness. And so there are three themes. Theme one has to do with character, Frederick Douglass, and MLK. So I began theme one by citing the famous phrase from MLK's 1963 speech at the March in Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. And so there he says he has a dream that one day his four children would one day live in a nation where they would be judged by the color of their skin. They would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And so what I do is I begin with that because it really sort of captures the intellectual tradition that informed MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. And I don't think any other public figure in modern times has captured those sentiments in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. did. And so that's exactly where I begin. I begin with a discussion of character. And so I locate that discussion, I begin that discussion with the definition. And so the definition that I'm proposing for this idea of colorblindness in terms of race relations is that the mere possession of hereditary qualities like race should not confer moral merit by their possession or non-possession. Instead, moral merit can be and should be conferred upon an individual's actions because actions reveals one's character. So I start by discussing character in the context of Aristotle and the ethical framework of eudaimonia. And so I won't get too much into the weeds here, but essentially the idea is captured in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And so there, character is the locus of moral agency, and it dictates and it determines the sorts of actions, praxis we engage in. And so to me, we can't separate character from color blindness. Now, it might sound anachronistic because we're talking about the Greeks, but ultimately what MLK talks about in terms of character is essentially this Aristotelian tradition of character as being the locus of moral agency. To me, the position of colorblindness is rooted in that idea of character. So what we're opposing to character would be these ascriptive qualities, race in particular, gender. These are all superfluous, particular elements that are a part of an individual, but do not define who they are. It's ultimately character. So after I give a grounding of character as it relates to this idea of colorblindness, and by the way, the people that I mentioned in that portion of my book regarding character, Aristotle, of course, Plato, Cicero, early Christian thinkers. So I try to give a nice sort of comprehensive sense of that tradition as it relates to character. And so if we move forward nearly 700 years later, these themes of character and what's presupposed by character, in particular, that it's the locus of moral agency, is captured in a little book called The Columbian Orator. And The Columbian Orator was published in 1797. The author was Caleb Bingham, a graduate of Dartmouth. It consists of nearly 84 pieces, literary pieces, philosophical pieces, sort of the classics of Western civilization. The reason why it's so significant is because someone by the name of Frederick Douglass got a hold of that as a 13-year-old. And he points out in his book, My Bondage and My Freedom, it was that little book that really motivated him. Not consciously, because he was pretty young, but it motivated him. And eventually he derived two ideas from that book. The first was reason is the differentia of the species, which means that it's reason, the ability to deliberate, that distinguishes us from other species. It makes us exceptional. It makes human beings exceptional. The other is that liberty is good in and of itself. It has intrinsic value. So little Douglas is taking all of this in. Again, he's not explicitly aware of this, but this becomes clear in his autobiography once he's able to articulate it. But what this little primer does for Douglas, consisting of these classic pieces, he says it sort of put him on the same level as whites. And so remember, he's a slave at the time that he comes into contact with this little book consisting of classic pieces. But he speaks really movingly about the influence of this little literary gem. And specifically, he says it taught him about American republicanism. And so I find that to be very powerful. So I spent a little time talking about that. And then I transition into taking some of those ideas that Douglas gets from the Columbian Orator, because I argue that in some ways it helped him move away from Garrison and the Garrisonians. So remember, Douglas, as an abolitionist, meets Garrison. He's almost like a father figure. And Garrison was very influential, not just in terms of Douglas, but for the anti-slavery cause. And so when we make that transition from Western philosophical ideas that he captured or was captured in the Orator to his eventual evolution from Garrison, because Garrison and the Garrisonians felt as if everything in America was racist. Basically, they argued that America was systemically racist. In a lot of ways, they argued on the side of the pro-slavery individuals and groups of thinkers of the time. And so Douglas grew restless with arguing on the side of the pro-slavery advocates. And so eventually he comes into contact with individuals by the name of Salmon P. Chase, people like Jared Smith, people like William Goodell, and Lysander Spooner. Lysander Spooner in particular wrote a book titled The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. But all of these individuals ultimately helped Douglas to evolve away from the Garrisonian position, which didn't advocate for political agitation, because Garrison felt as if the Republic, the founding American documents, were corrupted ultimately by the issue of race. And so there was no room for Douglas to really engage with the system because Garrison was apolitical. And so I tell that story to illustrate the point that when Douglas starts evolving away from the Garrisonians, when he starts seeing the American founding documents as being colorblind, as being anti-slavery, we see two traditions coming together. We see the ancient philosophical tradition, literary tradition, the Western intellectual tradition, being brought to bear within the American context to shed light on the founding American documents. That ultimately led to the split with the Garrisonians, because Douglas now was committed to founding American documents. And it was the preamble to the Constitution in particular that was so significant for Douglas. And so I tell that story. It's a fascinating story. That's probably the longest chapter in the book, but it's worth telling. I'm not the only one who's told that story, but I think I tell it within the context of this idea of being colorblind. And I think that's what makes it unique and worth taking a second look at. What I do next in part 2 of the book is I look at the opponents. I try to grapple with the opponents of the principle of colorblindness. And those opponents are well known. People like Derek Bell, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi, and Robin DiAngelo. Now, I treat these individuals together initially because each of their ideas, or their ideas taken together, essentially argue that America is systemically racist, and Western civilization in particular is quite racist, both in terms of African Americans in particular, but in terms of people of color. And so what's the thesis? The thesis there for the 4 individuals that I treat is that America is intrinsically racist, systematically racist, systemically racist. And it's a version of original sin, right? It's a secular version of original sin. And so there's very little that can happen or take place in terms of Black advancement, because ultimately the system is stacked against people of color and African Americans in particular. Who are these people in terms of their occupations? Well, they consist of journalists, intellectuals, activists, academics, but it's academics in particular that have had an outside influence. But not just academics. I have a chapter devoted to diversity trainers. I think diversity trainers have done quite a bit in terms of promoting the ideas of the 4 individuals that I treat, and it's been very, very divisive. And so once I move from treating the 4 as a group, I break them into parts, sort of individual chapters. And I start with Derek Bell. So he's typically associated with CRT, and critical race theory sort of grew out of the legal studies movement in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And with Derek Bell, he's been very influential in terms of a couple of ideas. And so it was really after the death of George Floyd that we got ideas that were associated with critical race theory. And so it became mainstream. And so that's why I focus on Derek Bell first. He really is the trendsetter in terms of some of these other movements like DEI. So there are three basic ideas that he promoted. So the first is racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's ordinary. It's natural. The second was racism will never be eradicated in America because it serves the material and psychic interest of both white elites and working class whites. And so what follows from these two claims? Well, Derek Bell was a lawyer, law professor. I think he was the first Black law professor tenured at Harvard. Eventually, he ended up leaving for political reasons, but he was an educated man, very smart man. And so his impetus, right, sort of his motivation was that traditional legal standards of objectivity and neutrality were useless when it comes to African Americans because the system is so corrupt. There's no way that any sense of objectivity or colorblindness or neutrality could be effective. And the best way to counter that would be a positive type of discrimination. And that's exactly what he advocated. But ultimately, he says, well, because African Americans will never get a fair hearing in America, those two are useless. And I'll say a little more about that in a second. So I mentioned two already. Racism is natural, it's not an aberration, and that Americans will always be racist. And the third is this concept called interest convergence. And so basically what this thesis holds, the thesis of interest convergence, is that the majority group in America, white people, will only tolerate advances among people of color and African Americans if it serves their interest, both upper middle class whites and working class whites. And so he says the way this works is, for example, when you look at the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education, striking down separate but equal, that was only allowed to take place because of two reasons. The first is we were fighting communists, and we had to put up a united front, both at home and abroad. That was the only reason. So it served the psychic interest of white Americans, both upper class and lower class. He doesn't tell us how it affects the lives of lower class or the psychic interests of the lower class. But nonetheless, he says that decision was allowed to happen because it served the interest of the majority group. Secondly, he says it wedded African Americans to the system. It gave them hope, right? It kept them committed to the American project. And so for him, that decision was simply in the service of white Americans, right? And we consider that one of the landmark decisions in the civil rights movement. And so, as you can see, he's quite skeptical, very much opposed to anything that would advance African Americans and people of color. And he continued to believe this until the end of his life. He passed away in 2011. So that's the third, interest convergence. After I treat Bell, I say a few more things in terms of interest convergence, but that's really the key sort of takeaway from my treatment of Bell. And then I get into some of the specifics regarding how wrong that is. I mean, we only need to look back to the evolution of Frederick Douglass away from the Garrisonians to see how wrong Bell's thinking was. And the other thing that's interesting about Bell is he had this defeatist attitude when it came to Black Americans and their advancement. And so he says, well, maybe we should see Blacks as like Sisyphus in the Greek myth, right? So Sisyphus is condemned to roll the rock up the mountain, the boulder up the hill, and then it rolls down, but he's condemned to do this for all of eternity. And so essentially, Bell says, well, we should imagine African Americans as happy in sort of defying their situation. It won't get any better, but in the way that we imagine Sisyphus happy as Sisyphus turns around to roll the boulder up the hill, we should imagine or see African Americans as defiantly happy in terms of their situation, even though they know it won't get any better. It won't get any better. And so I take issue with that. I get into that a bit more, but it's interesting how pessimistic Bell was. And then next I treat Ibram X. Kendi. There I say quite a few things, but essentially Kendi comes at the issue of race in a very similar way to Bell. And his position, as we all know, this idea of anti-racism, either you're anti-racist or you're racist. So there's no other position. I sort of tease out what exactly that means. But ultimately, the issue that I think Kendi, his ultimate argument seems to be that Black Americans are discriminated against because we don't see equal outcomes among groups. We tend to see Blacks getting the short end of the stick in all areas, economic, educationally, in terms of health. And he says, well, there's no genetic reason for that, and so it has to be racism. And so I take issue with that claim because there are so many issues that can lead to unequal outcomes. And they have very little to do with race, very little to do with race. And so what I do there is I look at some other thinkers who have similar ideas regarding unequal outcomes. So I talk about luck egalitarians. I talk about Rawls a bit, John Rawls, the ethicist, because all of their positions seem to align in terms of if there's any unequal outcomes in terms of individuals or a group, it has to be due to a concerted effort to make that group or individual unequal, or at least the conditions that are set up are such that that individual or group will not achieve up to the level of other groups. And so essentially I argue that culture often determines inequality in terms of group outcomes. And so there I cite Thomas Sowell, some of his work in particular. And so basically what I argue along with Sowell is that culture includes values, and there are certain values that groups have, and that's what motivates them. And those values, once they get actualized, once they're practiced, it often leads to unequal outcomes. And so it's not so much that it's race, it's often values, it's often culture. And it's not to deny that vestiges of race surely has affected Blacks in certain areas, but I think those issues are being addressed. But in no way would I claim that racism is systemic to the system as a whole. And so there I get into culture. Again, I talk about Thomas Sowell, and I essentially argue, I refute, I think, some of the claims that are made by Kendi, some of the broad claims. Out of the three, I would say between, when you look at Kendi, you look at Bell, and then you look at Coates. I mean, Kendi certainly is the most vacuous of the three. I mean, he's quite glib, but there's not a lot of meat in his writings or thinking. But for some reason, he has a following and he's quite influential. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on him among the others. With Robin DiAngelo, her impetus, her focus seems to be the idea that in a racist society, there's no way that we can be objective or impartial. And so she seems to argue against some of the leading ideas that we find in the Enlightenment. And so what I focus on is things like individualism and equality. So she seems to be opposed to all of those ideas that we come to associate with the Enlightenment. And I sketch out some scenarios in which those ideas have been quite helpful in terms of Black advancement. And so we only need to look at the civil rights movement in terms of what did they appeal to in order to get a broad swath of Americans to assist and to be allies in helping Black Americans to be equal before the law. And so all of that, including our founding, you know, when you think about our founding, you think about Locke, you think about that whole tradition of Enlightenment values. Now, it's not to say the Enlightenment was perfect, it wasn't, but I mean, in terms of some of the ideas that animate our country, as well as some of the movements within our country, in terms of both women and people of color, I mean, the Enlightenment and those ideas were decisive. And so DiAngelo goes out of her way to disparage many of those Enlightenment ideas that have defined us as Americans. And the other issue with DiAngelo is because she's a diversity trainer, she really gives us a perspective in her book. And I'm speaking specifically of the challenge of talking to white people about racism, so white fragility. So she gives us a perspective that's really helpful because you see there that, again, these ideas that these Enlightenment ideas are sort of disparaged. She sees the group as prior to the individual, and it's the group that defines the individual. And that's what we should recognize both culturally, but in terms of law, we should recognize that the group takes priority. And she explicitly believes that when we talk about the group, we have to make a distinction between those who have power and those who don't. And so, of course, she says that white people have power and people of color, African Americans in particular, are the victims. They lack power. And so it's that whole dynamic that she fleshes out in this book and the ideas that I take issue with. And so there's a nice chapter. There's some ideas there that I focus on. I won't get into those here so much. Maybe they'll come up. Some of those issues will come up during our question and answer period. But those are the main takeaways in terms of DiAngelo, sort of this anti-Enlightenment perspective, which informs her idea of what it is to be a diversity trainer, but also a person who believes that racism is systemic in America. And then the last part of the book, sort of part 3, I tried to sort of sketch out maybe some pathways forward. And I do that by focusing on a couple of things. The first thing I focus on is a term that I borrowed from Roger Scruton titled oikophobia. And so it's a combination of two words, oikos, house, home, and phobia, fear. And so in the context of Roger Scruton, the way that he uses it, he defines it as sort of a hatred of home. The idea that intellectuals tend to be very dismissive of their native country, their native environment, and that they're more open to those who are on the outside. the foreigner than they are to their fellow native citizens. So I take that idea and I apply it to the American context. And basically what I argue is that, at least for some Black Americans, there's this sense of oikophobia. So it's not so much that they have a hatred of home in sort of the broad sense, although I think there's an aspect of that. But I think that, there's an alienation from their home in particular, right? Their families, because there's a lot of broken African-American families. When you look at the rate of single parent families, the fact that 38% of Black children are raised in female headed households, there's a sense of brokenness there. And I'm not saying all, but there's a sense in which some of these racial ideologies, some of the arguments against colorblindness, I think is due to this sense of oikophobia, the fact that there's a disconnect. And so what I argue is, if we can make this community whole, if we can begin to talk about the success sequence, if we can talk about things like delayed gratification, right? Bourgeois values, right? All the things that a lot of liberals do not want to talk about. But if we talked about some of those things in a way that's honest, I think we can make these families, a lot of Black families, whole. And by doing that, I think this idea of oikophobia will dissipate. But I think a lot of the divisiveness that we get, at least in the Black community, because I'm familiar with that community, is due to familial conditions, familial situation that at least some African Americans find themselves in. And so I try to chart a path forward in terms of at least advocating some ideas that might strengthen the family life, home life. And so marriage is one in particular. In the remainder of the book, I get into, if we're going to talk about colorblindness, it might be helpful to talk about identity. And so I look at two authors in particular. I look at Fukuyama, his book Identity, and I look at an Israeli scholar by the name of Yuval Tamir. I might be mispronouncing her name, excuse me. And so each of these authors treat identity in a very interesting way that I find helpful. With Fukuyama, he subscribes to sort of a creedal conception of American identity, and I get that. And he references Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War amendments, and I get all of that, the new birth of freedom. But I think what he advocates is limited in terms of just a creedal conception of an American identity. I think that we need to couple that creedalism, not just constitutionalism, equality, natural law in some respects. All of that's fine, but it's very abstract. But I think if we couple those ideas with sort of cultural practices, I think that's more powerful more powerful in terms of arguing against the idea that America is systemically racist. I think in the public square, the sort of atavism that we get with people like Coates, with people like Derek Bell, can only be argued against in terms of a national identity that combines creedal conceptions with cultural conceptions. So there I argue against subnational identities based upon this national identity. And I do that by addressing some of the issues that are brought out by Tamir as well as Fukuyama. And then I conclude the book with a chapter, and more of a personal chapter, titled Comfortable Racism. And essentially I argue in the public square, we've accepted a lot of the ideas that the four individuals that I talk about promote. We've accepted, as a society, we've accepted those ideas for the most part. Now, there's a lot of us opposed to those ideas, but in our institutions, in our schools, we pretty much see Blacks as victims. And insofar as we do that, we are sort of settling into a comfortable racism, I call it. We're comfortable with separate dorms, ethnic dorms. We're comfortable with affinity groups. All of that, to me, lends itself to an idea of comfortable racism. So that could be due to middle class exhaustion with the issue of race. It could be due to the fact that most people accept the fact that, Blacks are exceptional and that they've been discriminated against, and we need to do all that we can to alleviate their condition. But again, I argue that all of that ultimately is a comfortable type of racism that we cannot accept, and ultimately it leads to a type of separate but equal. And so I conclude the book with that sort of call to action, which is not to accept comfortable racism, which ultimately leads to a separate but equal mentality, something that we tried to get away from many, many, many years ago. And just real quick, I did not mention, I do treat coats. I didn't mention coats in my overview, and we can get to that. But essentially what I do is I look at his book. It's sort of an analysis of his book, Between the World and Me. And so there, it's sort of a close reading of that text. And there are a couple of takeaways that we can discuss. But in any case, he talks a lot about the Black body, and I get into some of that sort of postmodern discourse. But for the most part, perhaps we can talk about that during the question and answer period. So hopefully that makes sense. That's sort of a broad overview. It actually was quite difficult to sort of summarize the book, or at least to give you a sense. I hadn't done that. And so it's been helpful. It'll be helpful going forward.
Thank you. You did a very nice job at
Thank you.
summarizing.
Very intelligent, interesting, lots to work with. So
Yes.
Why don't we go to the questions? And I've got a couple myself, but I'm sure others will.
I do too, but
Yeah.
let's start with some others first. Alexi, our postdoc.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a quick question. So you argue for color blindness, but you do admit that there are social issues, value issues that are specific to African Americans in the US. For example, where I come from in France, when we talk about color blindness, we include state policies. And so, for example, it's forbidden back home to collect statistics about ethnic groups or such things. But if you do admit that those problems that you mentioned are specific to African Americans, do you admit that for the sake of color blindness, there should be policies that are designed specifically to solve those problems in those communities? For example, single parents families, you could imagine people trying to find solutions to decrease that rate among African Americans. And those tools might include race-specific measures. Do you think it goes against your idea of color blindness?
I do think it does go against my idea of color blindness. I don't think the state of the African American family is unique to African Americans now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you're starting to find large, sort of broad demographics, even within the white community, the lower class white community, working class white community. You're starting to see the same sorts of conditions. And so I don't know if it's race so much, but I do think there are economic factors, manufacturing, let's say. William Julius Wilson wrote a book years ago, but he argues that the availability of men, marriageable men, he was talking about African Americans, it's been affected by certain economic factors. And so I think you're starting to see that within the wider community. So I don't know what specific race policies could address that issue as it pertains to African Americans. If there are any sort of policies that would pertain to African Americans, it would be helpful in general. I mean, it would help all communities that suffer from these conditions, which are due, I think, for the most part, to economic factors. Now, there's a whole literature regarding the African American family, the effect of slavery. There's a lot of debate. I'm on the side of people like Thomas Sowell who argue that, you know, yes, the African American family was, you know, the father. There's a pattern there that we did see. It's gone up and down, but he says that's not so much due to slavery as it is due to economic factors, and I buy that argument. I mean, on the margins, there's I think there was some effect for sure, but I think nowadays, I think an economic argument to make families whole, as opposed to specifically targeting African Americans, would be helpful. So in terms of the family, that's what I would argue. I mean, an economic argument would be helpful. Promoting marriage, for example, policies that promote marriage, not so much for the African American community, but for all communities, because we're starting to see the same conditions in other communities, children being raised by single parents.
Thank you.
Yep.
Gerald.
I think that the ideology you're arguing against has taken a major hit in the past 3 weeks. In particular, this template of seeing the world between oppressed and oppressor, white versus brown, Western colonialism versus indigenous. A lot of that has been discredited in the past 3 weeks. People have seen that when it's applied, it often is applied incorrectly. And a lot of people see it as part and parcel of anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering if you think the ideology you're arguing against is going to be affected by what's happening in the Middle East.
I think so. I mean, I've been trying to make that connection. I don't talk about anti-Semitism directly in my book, but I certainly think when you talk about intersectionality, we have anti-racism and anti-Semitism. Those two are part and parcel. And when you think about some of the statements from Coates, it's clear that there's a subcurrent of anti-Semitism. Now they want to argue that it's just Israel, you know, they're anti-Zionists or something, but often their comments sort of verge on anti-Semitism. And so I think this whole ideology of anti-racism, of DEI, is quite anti-Semitic in its implications. And so I think that, is it discredited? I'm not sure if it's discredited. I mean, there seems to be a split. I mean, we're starting to see those who found it difficult or find it difficult to condemn what Hamas did, and those who find it quite easy. So I think that the whole language of privilege, of victim, victimizer, makes it difficult for Jewish Americans to get a hearing in that space. You know, my wife is Jewish, and her experience in these diversity training sessions, they're awful. I mean, you know, if you say, hey, my grandparents were in the Holocaust, I mean, they look at you and they say, well, that's different. That was a different context. That has nothing to do with today. And so they silence you. They silence you. I mean, the issue there is we're talking about people of color, and we're talking about white people. White people are the victimizers. People of color are the victims. And it's that dynamic that we get in America, according to this argument, that makes it insignificant that your grandparents had to flee or were put to death during the Holocaust. And so, is it being discredited? I hope it is. I'm not sure if it is, but I hope you're right, that in fact it's being discredited. Or at least those who are surprised by their allies. Let's say our Jewish Americans are surprised by the left. Maybe that'll be a sort of a wake-up call to sort of really reflect on some of these ideas that have been promoted in academia. If that
Thank you.
helps.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to Alexi.
Yep.
Before we move on to something else, maybe I should have asked it before, Gerald. But so you said that values or culture of it takes precedence or has a more explanatory factor, explanatory value than racism. So, but that means, in terms of Alexi's question about, tracking groups, if certain groups are defined by having certain values that don't serve them as people, we can't quite get out of the thinking in terms of groups, can we? Because once you say, there's a culture, like there's a Black culture that doesn't promote family values, or that has kind of given into to instant gratification, or these kinds of things, you are still thinking in groups. And I think it's almost impossible to intelligibly speak about this problem without the group somehow taking precedence over the individual to some extent. And you could say that's not race-based, and I would agree with that for the most part, but it's still groups-based, because we would be blind if we couldn't say, there are certain, there are white working class groups, there are groups in, I don't know, that. And so this is, I guess, my question just needles you a little bit more in terms of what Alexia, I think, was also trying to get at. We can't quite have it both ways, be entirely on the individual side and say, well, there's bad values, there's bad cultures, there's whole groups now that we see in the white working class that have the same problems.
Yeah. I get into this a bit in the book, in the chapter on national identity. And so I think, of course, you're right. I mean, we're dealing with groups, we're dealing with issues of groups, and in particular for African Americans, we're dealing with certain problems that in some cases are unique to African Americans. So in that respect, we are talking about groups, but the issues that affect all of us, education, public order, a commitment to seeing each other as equal, all of that, if it has to do with all of us, that's when it becomes problematic, when we start specifically focusing on one particular group. And so, for example, the recent Supreme Court decision against affirmative action. I mean, there are ways to address inequality in terms of education when it comes to African Americans, but it's not the expense of other groups, or it shouldn't be at the expense of other groups. That just creates more race consciousness, both resentment and entitlement. And so I'm not saying that you're completely oblivious to groups. I mean, that's impossible. But I'm saying we can celebrate groups, right? We can celebrate St. Patrick's Day, Cinco de Mayo. I mean, all of that is perfectly acceptable. But when you start forcing other groups to submit to the unequal application of law, or the standing before law, that's when it becomes problematic. And so we can come up with policies that are economic, as I've mentioned, and I think those policies will go a long way in terms of alleviating some of the differences that we see among groups, especially in education, but again, especially in terms of the family. So I'm not sure if you still think I'm trying to have it both ways. So we do see the group. Of course, we see the group, and we can formulate policies to address those issues, but we have to walk a fine line between addressing those issues at the expense of other groups. And the other issue is that as a society, it's important that we call attention to issues that we think are contributing to the problem that we see in various communities. I think we turn a blind eye to some of those issues. And I think sort of public morality, if we spoke up a bit more, because we do this in our own families, right? We have certain standards that we apply to our own families, but in the public square, we turn a blind eye, right? We try to be objective or neutral. And I think things are as worse as they are because of that position that we take by default, maybe because we're intimidated or we just don't have the vocabulary. But I think there are ways to go about these issues that are not race-based. Did I answer your question, Anna?
Yeah, I mean,
so
what about health disparities? Rita says, well, yes, yeah, I mean, we'll keep talking about this. I'm stuttering a little. I haven't quite formulated it correctly in my head, but I guess the question is, why do these groups form? Why do they form as these kinds of groups? And I think even in Aristotle, it's true that the group takes precedence over the individual insofar as you yourself said, if you grow up in a shitty community, Aristotle is very reluctant to blame people then for not, forming the character that they should have. So it's a bit of a hen and egg problem overall. This is not to say I'm supporting anything that whatever Robin DiAngelo is. I'm just saying, in some sense, once we are in this terrible situation, they have a bit of a point. Because this kind of, and I think you said there's possibly bourgeois fatigue as to, well, we don't know what to do about any of this. And so we kind of give in a little bit. There is a bit of a point to that, it seems to me. But yeah, Rita wants to ask. Okay, you can say something else. We take more questions, and Rita wants to know about disparate health outcomes. Why do they exist? Those are clearly groups.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in this issue of health outcomes in terms of groups, but there are certain conditions that I think are specific to African Americans, diabetes, things like this. So the assumption is that that's due to systemic racism or some sort of inequality in the health system. I assume that's the assumption there.
No, you would have to address these disparate outcomes in a way that's targeted to particular groups, right?
Yeah, like
that's what you
screenings and stuff like that. It doesn't make sense to say everybody should be.
Sorry, that's good. It doesn't make sense to screen everybody. It's there seem to be natural underlying differences.
You mean biologically? I mean, there's like certain congenital health conditions might be specific to certain groups. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that for sure. I mean, to me, that doesn't seem to be divisive in terms of race. I mean, if we want to deal with sickle cell anemia, I mean, of course, we're going to deal with people who have it. And if the majority of those people are African American or people of color, that's helpful. I don't see how that's equivalent to something like affirmative action or equivalent to prioritizing one group over another. I mean, to me, that seems to be a type of distributive justice that Aristotle would agree with, that we would agree with. So I don't understand. I mean, I don't see that as problematic. Just like certain autoimmune diseases affect white women on average more. I mean, why shouldn't we put more money into figuring out why that's the case? I mean, to me, that's not divisive at all. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. It's medical knowledge that we can all benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Tom.
Hi, thank you for your work. Glenn Lowry gave a talk last night at Pioneer Institute, which there were many of the same themes as you might expect. One thing he started off by saying, though, was that his introduction was that, despite our differences on these issues, all of us want the same thing. All of us as individuals want the same thing. Well, I'm not so sure that's true, because today you have an awful lot of individuals who seem to want equity for everyone and not equality of opportunity. And Barry Weiss's solution is speak out, stand up. I just wondered if you have any thoughts about how, with the academia and the media and Democrats and progressives all against us, how we combat this. What can we do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I always go back to is, like you said, we need to speak up. I mean, I have friends, I have colleagues who they say they agree with me in terms of trying to get away from this obsession with race, but they don't want to speak up. And departments are changing in academia. There are certain trends like diversity statements. You have to sign new hires, adjuncts in certain departments in certain universities. This is a big deal. I mean, you cannot get a job unless you sign a diversity statement. Now, there's a lot of academics I know who disagree with that, but they will not speak up. They don't want to go against the tide of those who feel as if, well, if you say something, you're racist or you're just confused. And so I would say we need more courage. We need to speak up. We need to advocate this position, which I think is treating everyone, or trying to treat everyone equally, and try to provide as much equal opportunity as possible, but not equal outcomes, because that's just not possible. And that is what has gotten us into this position in the first place. And so I think that more honesty, people willing to stand up and apply the law evenly. And when we find that there are discrepancies, we need to address those discrepancies. And I don't think anything about that is controversial. In fact, I don't think anything is controversial about this colorblind position. I think that's the position that was sort of the reigning paradigm relatively recently, but somewhere along the way, we started catering to the idea that groups need to be equal in terms of their outcomes. And around that, we've gotten a whole ideology that has been quite corruptive and divisive. So I can't say anything sort of substantial in terms of what, other than to speak up. There's nothing more that can be done. I mean, unless we're going to let it run its course, and maybe what's happening in the Middle East will be that running that course, recognizing that identity politics is divisive and it's un-American, and that ultimately it's going to bring a clash here at home. So maybe we need that to wake us up, but hopefully not. Hopefully we come to our senses and we find the courage to speak up.
Thank you.
Yep.
Harvey has a question.
Andre, so I'm interested in manliness.
Yes.
I wonder how that affects the race question. I remember that in the famous Moynihan report
Yep.
of 1965, he spoke of the need for manly men to strut a little like roosters. And it seems that in our society today, it's the black man that struts and sort of represents manliness and resists the forces that go against it and are so strong right now. And And I suppose if this observation is true, and tell me whether you agree, I suppose there's both good and bad that comes from this. Manliness is in Greek is the same word as the word for courage, so what you were just calling for. so
yeah, that's that.
What about this whole? And I also have a notion that manliness is very important in slavery, or in the experience of it, and in the character of it. That what slavery did was to take a man's women away from him. One thing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so let me start by saying this idea of manliness is important. And Moynihan touched on something that I think has been ignored. And so I think you're right. I think when you think about Black males, there's a charisma there, right? I'm speaking in general. And I think you find a lot of that charisma bridled or channeled in the wrong ways. It needs to be bridled in a way that makes it productive. And so we can talk about, what's the reason for this manliness that we see among African Americans. Now, you could call it hypermasculinity, right? I mean, but I think there's something there that you touch on, and I think if we could bridle those inclinations that we see, and they've been quite creative, right? Now, I don't think those ways have been always productive creatively. You see a lot of bravado, for example, in rap music, but I think a lot of it's really pathological, at least what we hear on the radio. So I think there's a lot at play there in terms of masculinity. And so if there were a way that we could introduce that idea of manliness back into, and it's not completely gone, but at least for those families who lack a male, if we can introduce the father back into the household, I think the Black community would be that much stronger. And so manliness, I certainly think, is key. Now, that's not to disregard womanliness, right? There's a dynamic there that's quite powerful. But I do think this one factor, manliness, can play a role that's quite instrumental in terms of healing the divide in a lot of ways. Because I do think a lot of the resentment and racial animus has to do with the lack of the father in the household. And so, yes, manliness is very important. What can we do to strengthen it? Well, that's another book. I think your book is very helpful in that regard as well. In terms of slavery, you're right. I mean, Black males were taken out of the household, or at least the females weren't protected by the males. The Black males were treated in a way that was radically different from Black females, and so that's an issue. There's a lot of debate about the role of that dynamic in slavery and how that plays out in modern society. I have some thoughts about, what effect that might have had. I don't think it is as influential as others think, but certainly there was something there. There's something there that was a source of tension between Black males and Black females because of that situation early out of slavery. And then that sort of gets translated into the city, the Black migration. But I think manliness is very significant, very important.
Thank you. Avi. Avi, you need to unmute yourself.
I tried. Now I got it. Okay. When I heard Harvey's comment about strutting, what came to mind was in football games, every time someone runs for 5 yards, he gets up, makes signals first down, struts around. And I find it very off-putting. It's all sort of look at me, and it's supposed to be a football team, and as people have said, the cliche, there's no I in team. So maybe I'm just old school or old fashioned, but that form of strutting I find is off-putting. Started with the black players, but now you see everybody doing it. The question I had is with regard to, you mentioned college dorms becoming the black dorms and there's black graduation. We can remember back in the 60s when separate but equal was the claim of George Wallace, and in effect it was struck down. It was unconstitutional, but it was really, everybody knew that it was separate and unequal. Now the drive for, and segregated dorms in those days at a liberal college campus would have been unthinkable. Right. Now the motivation seems to be coming from the black students themselves. So we have a full reversal. George Wallace is celebrating in his grave because we've come back to the claim that this should be separate, whether it's equal or not. What I want to know, and I'd like you to address, if you would, that what does it say about black students that they now want that kind of separation? And does this indicate sort of a mentality of victimization, and that they want to in effect billboard that instead of the most important criterion being credentials or ability or output product? Now it's, I want special treatment because I've been discriminated against, or my great-grandfather was discriminated against. I mean, it's this victimization part of it. And if I could extend just a little bit, I see now going on in the very liberal centers of this country, like Cambridge and San Francisco, there's actually a reduction in the curriculum. They're not going to teach kids algebra because they found that the students of color weren't able to handle it. So rather than try to elevate everybody up, bringing the top down with the goal of being, well, let's have everybody equal. And if the achievement gets sacrificed along the way, so be it. I find it a really horrible way of approaching society and advancement.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. I think there's a disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation in the Black community. Not for all, but I think there's a large group of individuals who they see that it benefits to claim that they're victims. And I think they benefit from it in a way that it would be difficult for anyone to resist. And so I think that is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think you get that with separate dorm rooms. I think you get that with separate graduations. I think there are benefits. There are negative incentives that society promotes in terms of those sorts of practices. That's why I think it's important if we could, as a society, say no, we're not going to have separate dorms. I mean, in terms of merit, perhaps we can have engineering dorms, we can have the liberal arts dorms, but when it comes to race, I think we should just say that's out of bounds. But I do think that those who sort of delight in their victimhood or their supposed victimhood, they benefit from it, and it's the incentives that we put out there as a society. So I think it's ourselves to blame, and those who are in positions of power. The other part of your comment, you said, what was the last, just the last bit that you, if you don't mind?
I mentioned about in Cambridge and San Francisco and Oregon, they're deliberately sort of reducing the level of the school curriculum for kids. You know, they're not going to teach algebra in the earlier years because they decided that students of color just weren't keeping up. And so rather than trying to find a way to advance everybody, they're scaling people down. Right. And as long as we have sort of equal ignorance, well, then that's that's something worth celebrating.
That's right. And that's happening all over the country. I mean, even here in Colorado, there's a whole fight about zoning. And their argument is that African Americans, people of color, have been discriminated against in terms of housing. And so they want to change all the zoning in terms of neighborhoods, certain cities. I think in Minneapolis, they did this recently, or it might be St. Paul. I think it's Minneapolis. But the argument was it's due to race. Here as well, AP courses have been banned. I mean, it's no longer, you can't take an AP course because it's been systemically considered systemically racist. Those who typically take those courses tend to be white. And so there's something structurally wrong with offering AP courses. So we see that across the board. And what pains me is that it's often done in the name of Black Americans, African Americans. And I think that, you know, there's lots of Black Americans who excel academically, who want to maintain standards. But it's the group of individuals and also their allies within the white community that promote the same sorts of ideas. So we get sort of drowned out. Those of us who are opposed to the lowering of these standards, we get drowned out by those in the white community who side with those they perceive as being victims in the Black community. So again, I think that we have to show courage, we have to speak up, and we have to argue that, you know, we can disagree with those policies and not be racist. I mean, those two are radically mutually exclusive.
One last follow-up.
Yeah.
One last follow-up, if I could. You mentioned about the Black students and that they benefit from proclaiming their victimization status. Do they actually believe they're victims, or do they say, here's a way that I could get advancement? And so they're playing the victim card, but they really know that this is just a fake maneuver to get ahead. Which is,
yeah, that's what I think. It's a fake maneuver to get ahead. It's sort of utilitarian. And I think that again, the incentives promote that. Our incentives as a society promote that. So I think, you know, it's sort of wink, wink, nod, nod. We all know how to play the game. And I think that's precisely what you get in a lot of instances in institutions, in corporate settings. So that's why I think if we called out those sorts of practices, they might stop rather abruptly, because I think that we all know that there's a game being played, but we have to get to the point where we're able to actually say something.
I kind of doubt that most people are that's purely calculating, but usually if they are, then they find a way to justify that kind of calculation by finding the ways in which their preferential treatment is actually justified in their individual case. I think that's usually how it goes. You set these incentives, people take advantage of them, but in order to not feel like they are bad people who are playing the system, they will then think they actually do deserve it fully. I think that's
right. I think there's some truth to that, but there's also the issue of, at least on the academic level, I mean, you know, you have these elite institutions, and so they've done all they can to get people of color in these institutions, but you get a lot of mismatching. You've heard of mismatching. And so you get students who might not feel adequate compared to their peers. And that sort of lends itself to separation, right? Forming affinity groups, right? Because you want to be with other people who make you feel comfortable. If clearly your academic talent puts you at a different level than your peers within an institution that accept a certain academic level in terms of capability, I mean, of course you're going to feel alienated. And so it's that sort of alienation that has contributed to a lot of the comfortable racism that I'm talking about, because there's just a mismatch in terms of capabilities, and there's a discomfort level. And when you feel discomfort, you want to surround yourself with people who are going to comfort you. And then we get the justification of, well, ultimately, I deserve this because of my ancestors. So yes, I belong here. But in fact, there's some discomfort there in the sense that, well, maybe I'm a bit ahead of my skis here.
Sarah, finally.
Thank you. So I've been following. I'm moving shortly to Washington, D.C., and I've been following sort of the life there. And the city has, I mean, The Economist has written an article on this recently, just kind of the explosion of crime that's taken place really in the last 3 years. It's kind of been on this trajectory for a little bit, but really the last 3 years. And it's just heartbreaking because a lot of it is, it's not exclusively, but a lot of it is actually driven by teenage African Americans, both sexes, actually. You might think just men, but both sexes, who are not in school. I mean, there's a really tragic case maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago of an off-duty security guard who was it was an attempted carjacking by a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old African American teenagers, preteens. And the security guard, out of self-defense, shot one of them. He ended up in the hospital and died of his wounds. The mother of the other carjacker turned in her son so that he could go through the system and sort of get the correction and the help that he needed. And it seems to me that an example like that is really just, I mean, such a powerful example of so many of the different forces that could come together to really to really wreak this kind of tragedy on a particular community, right? So, kind of an absence of law enforcement presence, absence of fathers, and sort of an inability of obviously the schools are not doing their part, right? If these children are out and about, sort of not in school, right? No one's like reporting on them, they're not in school. And so I would just love to hear sort of from, this is my own sort of take on it, but I would love to hear from your perspective, how one would go about, trying to help all the different communities and all the different groups involved in a situation like that, right? Where there's the schools, there's a city or local government, state government, there's the families, police, those sorts of things. Again, this example is just on the top of my mind because it's just such a tragic, terrible example, right? I would love your take on that.
Yeah, no, I deal with the same concerns and the same sense of being overwhelmed when I hear about these situations. I mean, these sorts of things. There was a case recently here. I won't get into the details, but it had to do with, family, law enforcement, the lack of response. So the same dynamics that you mentioned, I mean, I think about those issues a lot. What I can say is, at least from my perspective, I think a lot of it begins in the family. And I know that sounds trite, but I think it's the case. I think when you have children being raised in environments without fathers, with mothers who are struggling, often mothers who are young, who themselves have issues, I think it's difficult to have a well-functioning, well-adjusted individual emerge from that sort of environment. So I think what we can do is, as much as we can, promote whole families, and that would be on sort of the societal level, in terms of policy. How exactly you go about that, I'm not sure if I have an answer to. We have DAs here who don't adequately prosecute criminals. And especially since the death of George Floyd, it's that much more difficult. I mean, for the longest time, I didn't see many officers around the city of Denver. Now I'm starting to see more officers, the response time picking up. So you're right. There are so many factors that sort of contribute to some of these awful issues. Some of it has to be dealt with by a number of different constituencies. But for me, and what I get into in my book, in terms of Black Americans, is the family. Now, I'm not saying the family is the root or the answer to all of these other issues, but I do think it's a start. And if we can start there, if we can start promoting both directly and indirectly the idea that children need mothers and fathers, then I think that's a start. I think that's a start. But yeah, the story that you tell, I'm very familiar, and I wish I had a solid answer, but just in terms of my impressions, I would say because of the family within the Black community, I think there's a lot of heartache and there's a lot of defeatism, and that has to be solved. And I think some of these other issues won't necessarily fall into place, but they would be lessened, perhaps a bit. So I don't know if that.
It's a complicated question I asked you. So
Yeah.
But that might be the reason why people are so reluctant to judge people by their character, because if you come from that kind of situation as a 12-year-old and you're going to be judged by your character, it seems like, ugh, that's just.
Yeah, but who do you hold responsible? Someone has to be held responsible.
I know.
Perhaps
what's
the parents.
interesting.
I don't disagree with you. I just see the reluctance, right? Because it seems so broken, so far down that
Right.
do not want to blame the victims. I know you have to start sometime, but it's just, yeah, it seems just such a.
One of the things that's been interesting to follow, kind of around this issue again, because I'm becoming interested in it myself, are the number of people on social media saying that parents need to be held accountable.
Right.
For the children who end up in these situations, right? Because there's no clear way to, so a city mayor can institute a curfew for people under 18, right? But that doesn't, or someone who, wears an ankle bracelet or something like this, right? Can let it, the tracking device go dead. Right. So it's, but the people who are calling, at least what I've seen, this is totally anecdotal, for parents to be held accountable are members of the African American community, right? Because they're seeing, they know that their kids are going to be affected by this in some way, right? Or the people down the road or something like this.
That's right. I mean, when you think about crime, I mean, who's affected by crime? Mostly, it's other African Americans in these communities. I mean, it's almost they're imprisoned in their own communities, especially the elders. And so it makes sense why you would find African Americans speaking out, demanding that justice be served. Because, I mean, everyone else is turning a blind eye, right? They don't want to be called racist. And so things have just gotten that much worse. So here locally, there's a school that there was a shooting in the high school. And the individual, he had a gun conviction, but they said, we have to let him back into the school, right? We have to let him back into the school because they were still investigating, but they knew he had a gun conviction, a firearm conviction. And this was just ridiculous. I mean, why would you let someone back into a school knowing their history? But the principal said, well, there's nothing we can do. We have to let this individual back in. And so it's those sort of policies, and maybe it wasn't a policy, maybe this was just arbitrarily decided, but the principal claimed that it was a policy of theirs, the district. And so these issues they're huge. You're right, they're huge. And maybe it'll begin with African Americans who are impacted by some of these policies or lack of policies. So it makes sense to me that you would get the African American community speaking out in a way that you've been seeing, but that's not enough. It's not enough. There needs to be sort of societal changes in terms of who we hold accountable. Someone has to be held accountable, and I do think in a lot of cases, or if it were up to me, it would be the parents, at least to some extent, somehow.
Yeah, but look where that leads. Look where that leads with the woman that you, Sarah, that you gave with the example. By the way, good luck going to Washington, D.C. Of the woman that you said who turned in her son for doing the carjacking. Now, if you hold the parent responsible, then is she going to face some kind of criminal sanction? If that's the case, she has an incentive not to turn in her son. And here she's doing the right thing, and yet you're going to hold her accountable. I understand the reach, but I don't know if it gets there. The other thing is we mentioned about the family, which I think would be a really good solution, but my goodness, even if you could do it in one generation, you're talking 20, 25 years to have the impact here. And I just wonder whether we should reach for something maybe that's a little bit faster, a faster track.
So what would that look like? I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to everybody saying speaking out. I find myself wondering what is really behind the motivation of these left-wing would-be do-gooders in proposing such really awful solutions of assuming, for example, that Black kids can't learn algebra or calculus, whatever is, therefore we're not going to teach it. And I wonder if, to play psychologist here, I wonder if deep in the recesses of their mind, what's really motivating these extreme measures is that they feel guilty because they actually feel that Black people are indeed inferior. And they can't face that. So they come up instead of looking in the mirror, they come up with any kind of extreme solution so that they don't have to face up to their own misjudgment, on my mind, misjudgment of people of color. Now, that's a wild guess, but the behavior is so bizarre and so off the mark that I'm reaching for something which is a lot deeper than what is being manifest by their statements and their policies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility. You're speculating. Perhaps there's something deep in the recesses of their mind. They feel as if, no matter what we do, things will remain the same. I don't know. I find it to be, I question that as well. I mean, I wonder. I mean, you think about some of these policies. I remember my wife being told that, you have to have rhythm when you're teaching Blacks. This was when she was teaching elementary kids. And I thought it was hilarious, but this teacher was serious. And so if you have that sort of mentality, are you serious in terms of what you're advocating, what you're saying, or are you, is just sort of face-saving behavior or actions? I don't know what accounts for it. I mean, it's the oddest thing, but I think it has contributed to the situation that we're in. So I can't account for the liberal mind, the white liberal mind, and what would account for some of these nutty ideas. But I do think guilt plays a part, for sure. Guilt. And I get into that a bit in the book because it's David Brooks. David Brooks really put Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, on the map. And an editorial of his from July 2015, if you read it, basically he says Coates, Coates educates us. He educates the public in terms of Black males. But when you read that book, I mean, it's very anti-white, it's anti-American. It's anti-Black Americans who think differently from him. And so I wonder what would motivate someone like a Brooks to advocate, to endorse someone like Coates, especially considering Coates's position on Hamas and Israel. I mean, it to me, it doesn't make sense. I mean, so I don't have an answer. But I wonder as well.
Although Rita worked for David Brooks, she's not going to answer this either, but she'll get the last question today.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't work for him in 2015, so I have no account of that. But my question is whether you think, I mean, so the trend since 2020, I mean, right around 2020, right after the George Floyd incident, there was this kind of mass panic about race. And obviously people sort of put in place a lot of policies and did a lot of things that seemed very radical at the time. But I wonder if you get the sense that there's a kind of exhaustion with that moment. And if you think about sort of empirical evidence of that, you know, a lot of states that have banned diversity statements, for example. So I'm not in Texas right now, obviously, but really I'm in Texas. They've banned DEI. That has happened not just in Texas, but in other red states as well. You know, the kind of revelations that the Black Lives Matter founders had mismanaged a great deal of their money that they got from charitable donations in 2020. The revelations about Ibram Kendi's BU Center kind of imploding, and the Supreme Court decision that you mentioned also on affirmative action. Whether these sort of empirical data points suggest a kind of direction of peak wokeness, or wokeness having peaked, and now being sort of on the decline, not because people have stopped believing all of the things that you're describing, but just because they got kind of tired of all of that at a very high pitch, let's say, and want to sort of move back into a state of normalcy rather than kind of panic. And so I was wondering whether you think it is the case that wokeness has peaked, especially the wokeness related to race issues, and whether these things are a suggestion of a trend back towards a kind of equilibrium that's probably more salutary.
Oh, exactly. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's hopefully that trend line continues, because I think you're absolutely right. I think we're starting to see at least questioning some of these practices and policies, especially after the death of George Floyd. Even here in Colorado, in certain schools, that whole diversity framework, diversity trainers, their budgets have been cut, or they've been cut completely. And so I think it is sort of a weariness, a recognition that we went too far in terms of this great awakening. And so, yeah, the empirical data points that you point to, I think, are trending in the right way. I think that what the decider will be is over the next couple years, what will we be talking about in the public square? I think that'll decide, or at least that'll tell us whether or not this trajectory, in fact, is the right one. I'm not completely confident that it's reached its peak. I think with the Hamas-Israeli situation, I think you're starting to see some lines being hardened, and sort of the resupplying of some ideas that might have been on the down trend. So I think the jury is still out. I think the jury is still out, but I certainly think that there are places, quite a few places, that have called into question some of the practices that were just taken for granted in the past, especially in terms of the death, or in the wake of the death of George Floyd. So I think you're right. Will it continue? I'm not sure about that.
Well, Professor Archie, we have to stop.
Okay.
I want to thank you. You gave us a lunchtime treat of calm and intelligence. And incidentally, I think you made a good case for buying and reading your forthcoming book,
Excellent.
The Virtue of Color-Blindness. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I appreciate the invite, and I enjoyed the questions. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you. Bye-bye.